We talk about board politics and...
No,
Yeah,
we're going to learn Gemara.
We're done.
We're going to learn Gemara.
Please?
Maybe your board politics will be
boring.
Now that I'm back, you sure you want to talk about it?
inspired by the Gemara, perhaps.
The length of the meetings are inspired to
So-
do it.
We need a Jubilee.
So first of all, I'm glad to be back. Of course, we will not be. We didn't meet last week, and we won't be meeting next week because it's Shavuot. But we will.
Thank you for the reminder. Ugh.
And then I will be gone for a little while longer. But then I will be back in July without interruption. You should still be meeting. Class will still be meeting, even if
next
I'm not
week.
here. But not next week. And then we will. We'll be back at a sort of a regular, normal stuff starting in July. So we'll send emails over the listserv. So if you're not on the listserv, make sure you get on the listserv. So that way nobody gets confused. If you're on the emails, it's there. It's in the bulletin, the link to the listserv, or you can send me an email and I'll take care of that. Okay. Turn to page 202 or...
82.
the middle, 280, what did I say?
200.
Sorry, 282. I still have my coffee to drink. And we're right in the middle of 8b. Page 8b. And I actually want to point out, we are now in the month of June. And we started this class in June last year. And so we're really at an incredible thing. I'll speak for me personally, to be learning in a class like this for a whole year. That's pretty amazing. So we're just about at the year mark, and I think regardless of how long you've been here, you are part of the journey. Even those people who are online.
Because even if we got here a day before, it is as though we have been here the entire year.
Amen. I love it.
Aren't you glad we don't pay rent?
That is a perfect encapsulation of our Talmud, and I have nothing else further to say. We will move on from that. That's perfect. All right, we're at the bottom of 282. If you notice in our very nicely punctuated text, you'll see that the first word is in quotes. Now, part of that is just sort of common editing technique. What does that mean? Just for us as learners.
Oh, it's a quote from the...
You're saying the quote from the Mishnah?
It's a quote from the Mishnah, right? Which means that we're going to be commenting on some idea from the Mishnah. It's not from the Torah, but it's a reminder. Oh, what we're talking about is Yovelot, the Jubilee years. Okay? Third line in the Aramaic, you'll see the word dichtiv. Just as a reminder, what does that tell us?
It's taught in a baraita.
It's not taught in a baraita.
Torah.
It's written.
It's written, and when we say it's written, what is it written?
It's
Torah.
Okay.
It's written in Torah. I also often ask it with Titania.
Okay, there
You were
Titania,
ready
that's
for
it.
it.
was written.
When the next Titania comes, I know who to call.
Okay.
So we know that we're going to have a quote. We're commenting on something from the Mishnah, and then we're going to get a verse. I guess most of you have read this section already, but either way, we might make the assumption that we're going to get a proof text, right? That's why we're getting our verse. Okay? Can I get a volunteer to read the first paragraph in English?
I'll read.
Go for it.
The Mishnah teaches the first of Tishrei is also the new year for calculating sabbatical years. The Gemara asks...
Wait a second. I don't think we're on the same
We're
page.
not in the same. Where are we,
282.
Jeff?
282.
Which paragraph?
The bottom left.
It's the bottom little squiggle thing. No.
Jubilee years?
The very bottom?
Where it says the Mishnah teaches the first of Tishrei is also the new year for Jubilee years.
Okay.
Did I miss a week? The Mishnah teaches the first of Tishrei is also the new year for Jubilee years.
Great.
The Gemara asks, is the new year for Jubilee years on the first of Tishrei? Isn't the new year for Jubilee years on the 10th of Tishrei, Yom Kippur? As it is written, then shall you cause the shofar to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the Yom Kippur shall you sound the shofar throughout your land. And you shall halo the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout all the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you.
Awesome. Thank you. So let's pull this apart little by little, and then we're going to go and look at the notes on the side. So first is we learn, according to the Mishnah, what? What about the Jubilee year?
That is the first of Tishrei.
Right, it starts in the first of Tishrei. Then, what does the Gemara do?
But wait.
Right.
There's more.
Right, we're asking, now we have a challenge, right? Well, wait a sec. Is it really on the first of Tishrei? Isn't it really on the 10th of Tishrei instead? And why is that question reasonable? Based on what?
Based on the Torah text.
On the Torah text. What does the Torah text say?
It says, on the 10th day of the 7th month, on Yom Kippur, shall you sound the shofar.
Then shall you cause the shofar to sound.
Right. Right, that's because of the verb.
It's a huge
To
over.
blow shofar is like to shofar, basically. But either way, right? So the verse says on the 10th day of the 7th month. But how do we know this has to do with the Jubilee year? That's when Yom Kippur is. Great. But how do we know this is Jubilee year?
It says, it shall be a jubilee for you.
Right? So at the end, right?
It's
So that's
tying those two events.
correct. So on Yom Kippur you sound the shofar, and you shall hallow the 50th year, which shall be a Jubilee year for you. So now we have an intrinsic link in the book of Leviticus.
I don't necessarily agree that there's a linkage there,
Okay.
because that last sentence, it appears to me to be discussing the Jubilee year.
Okay. And so I'm going to make the argument that the word "and" connects the two ideas.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Is that fair?
Yes, specifically since there were no periods and punctuation
Sure.
when Talmud was written.
Sure. Oh, this is a Torah verse, none of which is even quoted here,
No,
right?
Right.
But either way, we can hold some skepticism. Perhaps these things are not as linked as we wish, as it seems that they might be, right? So I'll give you that. So let's read the note, the Jubilee year at the bottom in the background. Can I get a volunteer to read? I know it's really tiny.
I'll read
Go
it.
for it, Dee.
I'm under good
Doris.
pleasure.
Yeah.
The Jubilee year, which is the 50th year following 7 sabbatical cycles of 7 years, has a unique status. All the agricultural prohibitions of the sabbatical year must be observed in the Jubilee year. But in addition, all Jewish slaves, including those who agreed to continue in servitude beyond their initial term of obligation, are freed. And fields that have been sold are returned to their original owners. See Leviticus chapter 25. The liberation of the slaves and the restoration of the fields take place after Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year, special prayers are recited and the shofar is sounded as on Rosh Hashanah. The halachot of the Jubilee year are observed only when the majority of the Jewish... Well, that's interesting. Yes, that's a problem right there. The halachot of the Jubilee year are observed only when the majority of the Jewish people are living in Eretz Israel.
Wow.
Consequently, its observance was discontinued during the First Temple period, when the kingdom of Israel was taken into exile and was never renewed.
Great. So a couple of things. One is Israel does follow the sabbatical years. So I don't know that this is any different in terms of Jubilee, meaning to say, I don't know that there are any changes since this book was written in terms of what people are doing. The second thing, which is, I read this online, that they recently discovered another piece of Torah text online, like a physical Torah text from ancient times, one of the oldest, and it was the book of Leviticus to the exact same letter as what we currently have. So I think there's something interesting. Maybe it doesn't specifically relate to this, but if we're sitting and holding Leviticus, it's interesting to know that perhaps this really was the same Leviticus that other people were looking at.
Okay, does that mean, according to this, you can never really sell your land?
You lease it for 49 years.
You lease,
Yeah.
lease it,
Yes.
but the land never
Yes,
leaves the original
Correct.
owner.
And the reasoning there is that because the land belongs to God, not to people. I mean, I think that's the concept.
Right, but
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
the broader piece is that this is a radical socialist collectivization of agriculture, that like every 50 years, your private property is redistributed out for equities purposes, which is, like very political, going back to what we were talking about before, but it's what the Torah says.
That's I believe that's not. It's not that simple.
Well,
It's not that simple.
Say
Because
more.
there are places in Torah where God gives the land to Israel and to specific individuals for all eternity.
Like where and when?
But you can't eat pencils. You should.
It's the promised land.
So I think there's a miscommunication here.
Yeah, you're
I think
not
what you're speaking
disagreeing.
about
The
is
two
the
you are
handing of
disagreeing.
the tribe specific lands, right? Those become ancestral lands. Meaning to say, if I continue to be part of the tribe of Dan, then I always have a place in Dan's land.
Yes,
What
but
Mark is saying is that every 50 years, if you are from the tribe of Dan, you get your old land back, even if you sold it, right?
Yeah.
And that if you owed money, you were then absolved of that debt every 50 years. So you're not saying different things.
Oh, you
Yeah.
get it back.
It's reset.
It goes both directions.
release it.
It goes
You
both
reset it.
directions.
It's a 49-year
If
lease.
you made all kinds of bad business deals and everything else after 50 years, boom, it reverts
Sale
back.
in Israel isn't really sale, and we talked about this when you weren't here. But Hawaii has the same deal. Like half of the land of Hawaii is owned by the Kamehameha family, and therefore, when you make a deal to sell land that actually isn't really your land because it's part of the property of the Kingdom of Kamehameha, you're on a 99-year lease. And I know this because my aunt and my uncle live there. My aunt bought into a condo recently that only had 37 years left on its lease, and at the end of 37 years it was getting torn down. But she's already 75 years old, so she's like, great, I'll be dead anyway, no problem, right? So, but that's similar to here, which is like when you buy land, when I buy your land, Joe, I have to calculate it based on how far we are from the Jubilee. And actually, that was also partially in this week's Torah portion. Chapter 27 of Leviticus talks about making a hekdesh donation to the
Hekdesh is?
consecrated is the weird translation, but it's like land you give over. You've got, let's say you got 5 fields, and you're like, I'm not going to plant the 5th field, and I don't want to
dedicated to
deal
God.
with the taxes on it, so I'm just going to give it to the temple. If you decide after 10 years or 20 years, like, I really want that land back, I want to grow something this year, you got to pay them 20% to buy it back from them, but then you only get it for 40 years, and then it goes back to it could revert anyway. So like this whole concept of like, it all belongs to Israel, it all belongs to God is a thing that comes up over and over again.
So I would point out 2 things, and then I think we should move forward, because I don't want to get too bogged down in the Jubilee year without text to support it, right? The first is that there are sort of rabbinic ways that they try to get around it. One is called the Pruz Ball, right?
That's for Shemitah, but it's
For the
not
Shemitah.
for
So now-
for Yovel.
Got it. So then I am totally wrong.
You can't get around Yovel except that in modern Israel they don't do it at all.
Right, which
They
is
don't have good.
supported
By the
here.
way, according to my opinion, they don't have good reason to not do it. The point that Steinsaltz makes here is they don't do it since the destruction of the first temple. There's no like halachic. I've never come across anyway. There's no halachic reason to say like, and because there's no temple, we don't do.
Right, so the
Yovel.
argument here in the note is that the majority of Jews haven't lived in Israel since then.
I don't remember ever seeing that. in
I've never
Torah
seen
or
that
Gemara,
either.
So I don't know where they get that.
So
either.
I'm not sure either.
I was always under the understanding that most of the land belongs to Karen Yemen.
So
You're
this
right.
is
Yes.
That's
This
right.
is-
So
Does seem that
therefore,
way, doesn't
this
it?
is dangerous. I mean, at the rate things are going in America, I mean, there could be a tremendous exodus out of America, and the majority of Jews could one day, maybe even in our lifetime, be in Eretz Yisrael. In which case, the Orthodox Jews, as things go with the religious parties, holding the key, they could insist to reinstate the Jubilee years.
So I want to.
They would have to give up too much, if I understand properly.
Right, so I don't want
They
to
have to
wait.
give up
I do
their-
not want to get into Israeli politics right now.
Yeah. But why not?
Because, but I do think that it is possible that in our lifetimes, certainly my lifetime as the youngest, I think perhaps the youngest person here, that that the majority of Jews could live in the land of Israel, and the conversation about the institution of the Jubilee year, I think, is a real one, in a way that hasn't been true until modern time.
One of the sub-arguments that I don't remember if we talked about it 2 weeks ago or whether it's something I'm just misremembering from somewhere else is that the destruction of the northern kingdom and their dissipation throughout the 70 nations makes that impossible. That
Right.
we can never have
Oh,
a
'cause
time
We were
We
when,
don't
talking
know.
about that last
Right.
week too.
Right,
I mean,
right.
that issue.
which is a
we
good
don't
question
know.
as to whether that's legit or not.
Right. So I
We
think
don't know what.
So-
What do we know is?
That according to that opinion, we could never have a majority of Jews in Israel again because there's a small percentage of Jewish blood in
All these
billions
other
of
people.
people all over the
Oh,
world.
how comforting.
Perhaps.
So I think the other piece I wanted to name, and then I want us to move on, which is if you were in year 48, it's going to be really hard to lend money,
Yeah, really.
right? And so there's a challenge in terms of how we do business, how we navigate debts and other people's debts, and the trust we have in one another around the Jubilee year.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important, and this is what we're sort of going to get to, which is, why it matters when it starts. It matters when, what year you're actually counting, which is what we're going to talk about in the next paragraph. Right? So it really matters how long you really have. When it starts really matters. So you can pay back your debts, or not pay back your debts, or not lend, or lend. All of those things are wrapped up in when this starts. This is why it matters whether or not it starts on the 1st of Tishrei or the 10th. I mean, maybe a week and a half doesn't feel like a lot, but I think it matters in terms of knowing. Mm-hmm. So let's move on. So I want to point out the first two words of the paragraph, which is Hamani, which is the question which is translated as the question is according to whom. Okay. And then on the second line, you're going to see the word Ditanya, which you can put a little box around, which we know, Cindy, means it's taught in a Baraita. Exactly right. And then it says on the third line, Ma Talmud Lomar. So literally translated, that is what Talmud says, but what it really means is what does the verse say? Because when it says Talmud Lomar, it is referring to a verse. A Torah verse, yes.
It is taught. It means basically it's taught.
Right. So in this case, it would be translated as it was taught, but it's confusing because it says the word Talmud. We want to just be clear; it's going to be a Torah verse. Okay. Let's see if there's anything more. You'll see then that Talmud Lomar shows up again on the third to last line. Okay, and I think those are all the words I want to highlight for you. Again, I like to highlight these words because it's important to see how these arguments are constructed. Right? We want to see how these building blocks fit in together so we can sort of anticipate what's happening. So just to review, we had a statement from the Mishnah. The 1st of Tishrei is the new year for Jubilee years. Then we had a question. Well, is it really? Perhaps it's on the 10th with Yom Kippur, which we have this verse to support us. Right? Because it says, on Yom Kippur you shall sound the shofar throughout all of your land, and you shall hallow the 50th year, and it shall be a Jubilee year for you. Okay? All right, can I get a volunteer to read the next paragraph, right, which is going to resolve this, or presumably move us forward in resolving this issue? The Gemara answers. Go for it.
The Gemara answers, in accordance with whose opinion is this Mishnah? It is the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka. It is taught in a Baraita. What is the meaning when the verse states, and you shall hallow the 50th year? Since it stated that the shofar is blown on Yom Kippur, one might have thought that the year is sanctified only from Yom Kippur onward. Therefore the verse states, and you shall hallow the 50th year, which teaches that the year is sanctified from the beginning onward, from the 1st of Tishrei when the year begins.
Great. All right, let's pull that apart. Let's pull that apart. So, we have an opinion from the Mishnah that the 1st of Tishrei is the new year for Jubilee years. Then we had a challenge to it. Well, isn't it the 10th? We have a verse that proves us. Which means we're left trying to figure out, how did we get the 1st of Tishrei to start with? And that's the question it's starting with, which is, according to who is that first opinion? The 1st of Tishrei. And the answer given is Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, which is a name we've seen before, who says who asks sort of rhetorically the question, right? What is the meaning of when the verse states, "And you shall hallow the 50th year"? The answer is that you might have thought that on Yom Kippur, when we sound the shofar, it's from Yom Kippur on, right? The 10th of Tishrei is the beginning, and then the Jubilee year is the rest of the year. However, because it says, "You shall hallow the 50th year," they're saying what?
It's retroactive to the beginning.
Right, the whole year, right? It's not 50th year minus the first week or the first 10 days. It's the whole year, right? So what are we learning about the use of the word year in this section?
You better know when the beginning of the year is.
For sure, and that a year means a complete year, right? We sort of joked about it before. One day is as if a whole year. Here we're starting to learn sort of intimating this idea that a year is a year.
So if it's a year, it has to start on the first of the month.
Well, why couldn't it have started at one of those other New Years?
That's the wrong New Year.
Like as in like Nisan or something like that. It does talk about that a page or two before.
Because it's the shofar.
About
is that because
that?
it's put in the Mishnah already? I mean,
so here we have a connection right from the verse that we read that the blowing of the shofar is connected to Yom Kippur, which is connected to the Jubilee year, right?
Okay.
So we know it's somewhere around there.
But if they're willing to move it 10 days back, why not a few months?
It's a reasonable question. It's a reasonable question.
It's not.
Well,
Right?
technically, you're blowing the shofar in that month, where other months you're not blowing. Well, you are blowing the shofar.
Don't you blow the shofar every month, technically, at the
No.
new year? At the new month?
No,
Any month?
we do not. We do it
No.
during the month of Elul, which is the previous month,
Okay.
and we do it
Well,
and
But the verse says that you do it on the first of the month.
Yeah.
That's what the verse says.
the verse does
Not
not
here, but there's, look, we read it every month. There's a verse that says,
Right.
and on the first of the month,
And
you
on
blow the
the
shofar.
on the new moon, you shall
Right,
blow the
new moon,
shofar.
yeah.
It is the law. Blah blah blah.
Exactly right, yeah.
So
We read it every month,
okay,
yeah.
there you go.
So,
So clearly there is an argument.
quoted in
At
the
least
Psalm.
pull it back to Tishrei based on shofar, which is not the argument being made here. Let's be clear, right? That not that that's a bad argument. It's just not the one that's here.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a little of sort of, I would argue, gravity that's holding the Jubilee year's beginning to Tishrei. There's sort of enough arguments that's holding it here, but you don't think so?
I understand how they're trying to make the linkage, but it wouldn't hold up in a court of law.
Why not?
So
Other than using Torah verses to prove your case?
yeah, so you go from one week link to another weak link to another weak link, and it's not proof. So yeah, I can't argue that there's some linkage here, but proof? No. I mean, can you say with probable certainty? Legally 99%? No. How about reasonable certainty? Greater than 50%. Usually translated by the legal people to be 51% or more. So what's wrong with these people? That they're sitting there by candlelight coming up with this stuff? Is it that important that they make these weak links?
So I want to offer a different angle on this, and I would argue that they're not as weak as you're arguing. So there's two things I'm saying. The first is, remember the motivation of the rabbis is that the Torah, i.e. God has commanded us, and that's a real obligation, and that real obligation requires attention to detail. God is asking me to do something, I have a responsibility to do it as best as I possibly can. Right? So I'm then motivated to do the best that I can. That's the first thing. That they're not just, twiddling their thumbs. Now, in some places, like the Midrash, you may make the argument that they're, enjoying themselves by spooling out stories, by interpreting words and stuff. I'll give you that. But here, I don't think that's the purpose. The second piece is, I think our verse is very strongly arguing. I don't think that's a weak link at all.
he rests his case.
These guys were every bit as smart as us, maybe smarter. If we don't agree on how strong the linkage is, I bet you that they understood that they were arguing as to how strong the linkage was, and that's why they're devoting so many paragraphs to it.
Absolutely.
You know, one of the things that makes it strong is that this is in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, who is the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka. Like, we got like a chain.
Sure.
Right?
That's
Like,
nice.
and like, if you say this thing in the name of somebody who said really great things, it makes it like a stronger.
Right.
It's not just the like the Torah connection on its own. It's also the who's
And I'll argue that if they have to do that proves my point.
I would agree with you, actually. Yeah.
But
That's what they're in their system.
Right. So I think your point is well made, which is that a named person makes a difference. Right. Attributing a teaching to a person matters. Right. It lends authority.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Ethos, right?
I'm sorry?
Is that ethos?
Yichus.
In terms of
That's
like
connection.
yes.
No. I'm talking.
You're saying something else.
I'm saying like pathos, logos, ethos, like in terms of like appeals to argument.
Oh, I don't know.
That's
Well,
it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I don't know those well enough to speak to that.
Sort of
I mean, it's appeal to authority, if that's what you're saying.
That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
So technically a fallacy,
Oh.
according to the Greeks.
Wow.
All right, so
But
let's.
can we trace Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka back to when they got the Torah, when the Talmud said it, when it was there? And if you follow the line back, that was it.
Well, of course, the Moses to
Exactly.
Joshua to the prophets
So
to the men
it
of the
came
Great
from there,
Assembly.
and
to
there's no use arguing about it because that's the way it was given to us.
But they're arguing anyway.
Because they have nothing
I
else
think
to
the
do.
argument can be made that all of us
keep
could do
reading,
that.
You're gonna find
Yeah.
the
So let's
counter.
keep going.
Went back
Let's
to
keep
the
going.
original.
Well, this is an interesting thing. It's the challenge of writing down, right? So it's like music. It didn't, show up like Beethoven didn't show up on the page and then somebody played it, right? Actually, Beethoven showed up like in Beethoven's head, and he wrote down the best approximation he could. And in a way, Talmud is like that too, yeah. So like when you write it down, all of a sudden it becomes changed in a way that maybe it
Concrete,
wasn't
perhaps,
intended. Yeah,
right.
it becomes concrete in a way that perhaps it wasn't meant to be.
Right.
And that's why it was the
Right. So I
oral
think to your
law. That's why it
point.
was the oral
Right. So I
law.
think to your point, Talmud's purpose is not necessarily to decide everything forever
Exactly.
for everyone always.
Exactly. And when we write it down, we treat it as though
Correct.
that was the case.
Correct.
And so, you want a very concrete argument, but maybe there isn't meant to be one.
And that's why
Correct.
they-
Yeah, so there's a logic problem here. And so the way I was brought up is you form a hypothesis and then you try to prove it. What the Talmud is doing is they're saying this is the way it is, and then they're looking to prove it. They're doing whatever they can to find the linkage to confirm what they have decided. That's
I don't
not.
think so.
I actually think let's be clear that the scientific process that you described, the first one, did not yet exist at this time. Second, I would argue that it's actually much more similar, which is they've made a statement, right? They are offering an idea, a hypothesis, if you will, and then they're beating the hell out of it with different arguments, different proof texts to try, right? Which is testing your hypothesis.
So I'm going to disagree with you.
Good.
The scientific method did exist back then.
Fair enough.
Everything we know indicates that it did. These people, had, what we call high math. They could calculate how all the stars and
For sure.
moved around in the sky. But they didn't have the
It's just
luxury
observation.
of waiting around for a pure hypothesis. They were given things that they had a high stakes to prove.
So scientists do this all the time nowadays. And when they do that, at least some of the time, they're found out, and their hypotheses, which they say they proved, are destroyed. The Talmud, I think I've made my point.
Let's move on.
But God said, so you can't destroy.
So let's move on. So would someone like to read where it says, from here, Rabbi Yishmael, the next paragraph?
From here, Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baruch, said, from Rosh Hashanah until Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year, Hebrew slaves were not released to their homes because the shofar had not yet been sounded.
Pause. Let's just pause for a second. Right? Why is this sentence relevant?
Because they're saying it's retroactive back to the first.
Right.
The shofar wasn't sounded.
But they weren't released.
Right. So do they get their extra couple
We
days on the tail end?
we haven't finished reading the paragraph,
I
but
love Paula's. You said, but they're not released, and Paula said, but the opposite.
Right. So both things are true, which is right that if, according to Rabbi Yishmael, it starts at the beginning of the year.
Yovel.
The Yovel starts at the beginning of the year, but this statement also says that from Rosh Hashanah until Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year, Hebrew slaves were not released to their homes. Right? Rosh Hashanah ad Yom Kippurim lo hayu avadim niftarin.
They need them to have
It's like splitting the difference. Fairly
Perhaps. We haven't finished the paragraph yet.
I'm thinking the same thing.
So keep reading. I just wanted to highlight. That's really important.
And they were also not enslaved to their
that's
masters, as the Jubilee year had already begun.
Huh.
Rather, they would eat, drink, and rejoice, and they would wear their crowns on their heads, like free people. Once Yom Kippur arrived, the court would sound the shofar, slaves would be released to their homes, and the fields would be sold. That were sold would be returned to their original owners.
Great. So Rabbi Yishmael is sort of solving the problem we would have anticipated, right? Which is, okay, we've got these now 10 days between the 1st of Tishrei and the 10th of Tishrei. What happens, right? If the shofar has some sort of causative property, and yet we're also retroactively changing the previous 10 days, we have a problem, which is how do we treat people and land in those 10 days?
All right, so they partied for 10 days.
Basically,
they were in limbo.
sort
they
of
can't
like
go home, but they're not slaves anymore, so party.
Which is analogous to another case in the Talmud in the first section of Brachot, where the Kohanim go in. So a Kohen who is not ritually pure to eat truma has to go in the mikveh in the evening, but is not actually pure until the sun comes up in the morning. So there's this weird thing, right, Jeremy?
I don't know the section.
Okay, so it's this other similar case where the thing happens and they should be good to go, but they're not good to go because there's another thing that happens.
So do they party the rest of the night?
But I believe they eat their truma that night. So they're not technically, they're purified, but they're not really purified till the next day anyway. So it's like this gray area. The first act happened. There's a second act that needs to happen, but in the gray area, you're allowed to do the thing.
And this is why it has to be at the beginning of Tishrei, because if it were, say, one of the other New Years like Nisan, they would have to party for all this time and could afford it.
6 weeks.
Or they would have to keep them enslaved for that long, past the time when they should be free, and that's a human rights violation. So I'll give them their 10 days.
Human rights violation.
So,
okay, now there you go.
So I just want to throw in that dealing with the problem of gray areas is one of the things that Talmud is dealing with all the time.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, this says this and this says this, but what about this in-between bit here?
So,
it's
so you're arguing that Hashem created these gray areas, and Talmud is trying to eliminate them.
No, I would say
no, just to deal with. I mean, to
figure out how you
to
deal
figure out
with
how to deal with them.
I think the idea
Just
being,
you know.
and I think this is true in our own lived experience, which is that gray areas are part of inherent human experience. Right? We're constantly encountering gray areas every day. Right? So
Right,
I think the
there's
question.
There's this and there's this, and what happens here?
right. I would say that God creates a situation that's unclear, and the rabbis trying to interpret what God wants them to do, interprets it as a gray area.
It's probably not that great, God.
Doris doesn't like it.
Well, no, what I was thinking of actually was Mary Poppins. Because in several of those stories, there's a point where the clock starts to strike 12, midnight, and the day is going to change. But between the time when the clock starts to strike 12 and the last count of the 12 bells is the gray area, and that's the time in which dreams can be fulfilled, and the time in which a soul can suddenly wander off somewhere and has to come back. But the whole issue of gray areas, I think, is a real sort of like a human problem.
I must have missed that in Mary Poppins.
It's very.
I think I missed
It's
that.
in the new movie, actually.
It's in there. No, it's in there. It's in a couple of times in the books it happens.
So-
But anyway, I'm just saying, it's like this.
So I think gray areas are sort of
Cinderella
inherent
is
part
not
of
a
human
bad-
experience, and the Talmud is one attempt to try and resolve those as best as human
The
beings
clock
can with
starts
human
striking, you
knowledge.
turn
And at
to
least
pumpkin.
point them out.
Right, absolutely.
know.
So yeah.
So I'm looking at where Rabbi Ishmael ben Baruch is on the chart here.
Okay.
So he's.
Did you
pretty-
find him?
Yeah, he's pretty far
Really?
back. He's over on the left here.
Oh.
Second to the left. He's in this. He's under where you've got.
Does it say Rabbi Yishmael or Rabbi Yishmael ben Baruch?
So it is the one. No.
No, that's.
Rabbi
sorry,
Yishmael
never
ben
mind.
Elisha.
That's the other one.
A
That's the
different
other
one.
one. That's been.
Ben
It's
Elisha.
another
I never heard of
Rabbi
Ben Baruch.
Yonatan ben
No, I never.
Baruch.
I never heard of you, Ben
Where-
Baruch. So
where's-
my guess is
what?
it's
Comes up before. No, no.
Where's
So
Rabbi
came up
Yonatan?
before.
Here's Rabbi
Yeah, but he's
Yonatan
on the
ben
chart.
Baruch. That was the one.
Where?
That was actually
Where?
the one I found. So where's Rabbi Yishmael?
But where is
ben Baruch?
Rabbi Yochanan ben Baruch?
So if you look at the lines, 1, 2, 3, he's in the fourth
Oh
line
yeah,
down.
I see him.
You
You
see
see
him?
him
Where
there
is
on
he?
the left?
Which
Let,
generation?
he's
So
kind of
fourth generation.
Fourth generation down from the top.
But he's
on
not.
the way left.
Yeah. So he's Ben Baruch, but where is Baruch?
Well,
He may not have
Baruch
been a
might not
ra-
have
he may not have been a rabbi.
He was
Yeah.
not a rabbi.
Potentially.
Okay. So
Just
where's
like
Rabbi,
my father is
so
of
now
no
where's
religious
Rabbi
consequence in the
Ishmael?
Jewish world.
Where's Rabbi Ishmael? Is he in that same generation?
So this
Where is he?
the Rabbi Yishmael that is the son of Rabbi Ben Baruch may not be on this chart.
Okay. So what I was actually wondering, the reason I was looking was that I was kind of wondering whether there's a connection between how seriously we take his opinion about
Right.
his story about
So-
the slaves versus, was he there at the time when the temple was still standing, or maybe his father was, or his.
Sure.
In other words, was it within his own
Right.
personal memory?
So we
or
right. So
what?
we learned from the
Because he's
background
describing
that the
something.
Jubilee year didn't happen since the first temple,
Right.
which is 1500 years.
Right.
So this is
probably
all
he
from
wasn't
tradition.
there. Yeah. So this is all
For
from tradition.
sure.
But so the question is, suppose so first temple, second temple. So most of these rabbis even weren't there second temple
Correct.
on the chart.
Yeah.
How far back does the chart go? What's the beginning of the chart? There?
So you see Hillel and
I see
Shammai.
Hillel and Shammai, but
I think
they're-
Hillel
they're like
was
700
30.
years later, right?
30
No.
to 30 to 30.
Not that early.
Yeah,
Hillel and
that's
Shammai.
okay.
Hillel, or I'm sorry.
30 to 30. 30
30 to
before
30.
the Common Era to 30 of the Common Era is
Right.
Hillel
So
and
there's
Shammai.
700 years since the destruction of
The
the
one
second
who
temple.
used to get in trouble
No.
by
Of
the
pointing
first
out.
I'm
temple.
sorry. Never mind. Okay.
Yeah.
But okay, so anyone who's within the period of the destruction of the second temple, they would know what the custom was in the second temple,
If there was one.
if there was a custom. Right.
Right, because this would argue that a background note from Rabbi Steinsaltz
Yeah.
would tell us that there was no tradition in the second temple, that we were aware of because it stopped at the first temple.
Well, that there was no tradition to observe the
Jubilee, correct.
the Jubilee, and yet we're hearing this story from Rabbi Ishmael ben Baruch. So, what's the idea?
So let's be clear.
Yeah.
Some of it might be
'Cause it might have been
might
within
be
his
tradition.
memory.
The other
Yeah.
might be just a logical solution. He came up with it. It makes sense. This is what would happen,
Okay.
right? But I want to point out the following, which is we have an unattributed Mishnah text that we're attributing.
Yeah. Oh, good.
Right?
It's
Although it is during the right period of time, Rabbi Ben Baruch, Yochanan ben Baruch is from the right period of time.
Right.
So it's not like it's an impossible teaching. So I think those. I think regardless of if it's perhaps its historical veracity is less important to us than does it solve the problem. Right? I want to read one more. Wait, before
Right.
I want to read one. Wait. I want to read one more paragraph. Because only one more line, and it sort of introduces the counterbalance, which is to say that this is one solution.
Yeah.
This is one solution to the problem. How did we get to the first of Tishrei, and what happens in between? It's not the only solution.
Okay.
All right, can I get a volunteer to read that paragraph, which is mostly Rabbi Steinsaltz?
It's the one Gemara asks.
Yes.
The Gemara asks, and the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Ishmael, son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, how do they interpret the verse, and you shall hallow the 50th year? Gemara answers, they derive from here that you sanctify years, but you do not sanctify months. Interesting. According to this opinion, the court is commanded to sanctify the Jubilee year with the proclamation. This year is sanctified, but it is not commanded to sanctify the months with a similar proclamation.
Thank you.
So, what does that mean?
How do you sanctify a year without sanctifying the months that are within it? I mean,
So-
that's all.
So I think we need to be. So I'm not entirely clear on what this means. I'm going to be honest, but I have some thoughts. First is, what does it mean to sanctify a month? How is that different than sanctifying a year? What does that look like?
I'm not sure it is it?
Well, it clearly is different, right? Because he's saying they're saying it's different.
You can't free the people to return the land only for the month, though.
It's true. I would argue that we're talking about proclamations, meaning to say it's for the 50th year, not the year starting in Tishrei. That's the difference.
The 50th
It's about
year,
language.
It's when the 50th year, whenever the 50th year starts, not specifically the 50th
Right, that's
year
what I
because
think
it
this
starts
means.
in Tishrei.
That's what I think this means. I don't know for sure. I don't know if you have Rashi on there, Mark.
I have Rashi.
So I'd be curious to see if he comments on this.
Which one?
Rabbanan shanim ata mekadesh v'iyata mekadesh chadashim.
It could also be
Yeah.
saying we know it has to be connected with the new year because of this sanctified thing, which is what you do for the year. And so it wouldn't be at some other month because we need to have a year that we're sanctifying.
Meaning what?
Meaning that this is the time when we're sanctifying the year. Because the other, it doesn't, just like, do the other New Year's get sanctified as those New Years?
Or you're focusing on the sanctification piece.
Yes.
Jeremy's
that's a good
interpretation
question.
is clear. The year is sanctified.
Mm-hmm.
The year is sanctified. That sanctifies all the months of the year also.
Right, but we're looking for a time when a year
you
is being
can't
sanctified.
sanctify a part of a month. You have to
Well,
sanctify the entire month
Oh, I
because the
see.
entire
Okay.
year is sanctified.
The verse is
Whether you
"V'kadash
agree with that or
tem et
not, that's
shenat
another
hachamishim."
I'm sorry?
I'm just saying that's where they're going back to the Torah verse. It says "V'kidashtem et shenat hachamishim." You're sanctifying the whole year, the 50th year.
Right.
It doesn't.
Right. So what we're learning from the Gemara is two things, right? One is we're getting a new opinion, right? Where the content itself about years versus months, but also these are the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yishmael in his solution, but not his answer. Right? Meaning to say they agree that the year starts on the 1st and not the 10th, because you can't have the Mishnah be wrong. And yet, they disagree with his methodology, right? Which is to say that it has to do with the shofar and the 10 days of slaves or whatever. They're saying, no. It's a whole year, start to finish, period.
You can't do part of the month. 'Cause that's
Right.
not-
We're not talking about months here. We're not talking about weeks. We're talking about years. Years are our measurement. And years have a beginning and they have an end, and there's no gray area here.
So I'll accept the 1st of Tishrei. I would never, ever find someone guilty of murder based on this kind of an argument.
No, you can't.
Right, and neither with rabbis. For sure. They took capital offenses very seriously.
Does anybody do anything today to symbolically celebrate the Jubilee year?
That is a great question.
I don't know.
I mean,
I don't know the
obviously, we're
answer.
not giving back slaves, and we're not giving back land, and we're not canceling
So wait a
debts.
sec. We
Would
know.
you
Do
If
we
we
do
move on-
anything?
I say yes. There is a sect someplace that
But
celebrates the Jubilee.
Well, wait a sec. We're about to be in
I have no idea.
5780, right? This upcoming
Right,
fall,
right.
right at the first of Tishrei. In 20 years, we'll know.
Yeah, but I won't be here. I want to know ahead of time.
21, I think. 'Cause I don't
You
think
will
they-
be
It's not
here
exactly
to do
on the zero?
something.
No, because it's like the Western calendar. There's no year zero, right?
Right.
I don't know.
There's a great organization called Rolling Jubilee that buys people's debt. Like
For that year?
no, like debt forgiveness. Like they're a debt forgiveness.
Right, but
like,
I'm just
nonprofit.
wondering,
But they only operate once every 50 years.
No, they do this all the time, but they take their
I'm just
name
saying,
from
is
the
there something
practice.
once every
Board
50
meetings are
years that
short.
somebody does and says, welcome, we're in the Jubilee year? Or is it like, downtown when they declared this Judge Olson Day and you get a proclamation in the city county building and we go, whoopee-doo, and we all come down and take a picture and that's the end of your big day.
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to it. I mean, the soonest the most recent one was somewhere around 30 years ago.
So now who do we have to ask that might have been around that knows it then?
That's a really good question. Though.
So I remember during one of my trips to Israel,
No, not with some of the other things that he has told me.
That's a different issue.
We're not going there.
we saw a menorah. It was either gold or gold plated. The claim was it's an exact reproduction of the menorah that was in the temple. Now, so the point I'm trying to make is, regardless, there are enough Jews around so someone will swear that this was the way it was always done. And I don't believe it's an exact reproduction, but
it
they
can
do.
be because the descriptions we read about how you built the ark and how you did this and how you did that and the cubits for the ark and everything. The descriptions are so precise.
Wait,
that
let's
the
be clear about what
reproduction might be correct.
Let's be clear what a cubit is. It's from the measurement from the inside of your elbow to the
Right,
tips
and
of
it's
your
going to
fingers.
be different for everybody too.
Exact,
But
not so much.
But there's so many.
Right.
There are so many descriptions of things.
If you do the cubit, if the whole thing is built upon one person, then it will
It's
be a different
possible,
scale.
right?
It would be the same thing, but in a different scale.
So I think if anyone has seen a movie has anyone here seen a movie based on a book?
Yeah.
Sure,
Yes.
all of us, because it happens all the time.
And it's never the same. That's exactly it.
That's the point.
They take the highlight, or what they interpret.
No, meaning to say that taking a text to a visual, something visual, requires a
Well, they do
creative
that
act
with-
that is an interpretation, just like a translation is an interpretation, right?
So
It's
we've
not
got to
per-
figure that it's pretty close.
Maybe.
'Cause
I'm
we
not
can't-
saying it isn't.
We can't
yeah.
figure that it isn't.
Okay, so I want to end, and so
This is
for
bringing
today,
up so many other
and so
strange thoughts.
and so I want to sort of just pull together what we did today, which is to say we had a conversation about the gray area
mind.
between something that seemingly the Torah states that, which is the Jubilee year starts on the 1st of Tishrei, and the fact that it is connected to Yom Kippur, which is on the 10th. And so we've got a gray area that needs resolution. They're inherent. They're both in the verse. And so we have a problem, or at least an opportunity for solutions. Meaning to say, we have this gray area rubbing against itself, and as a result, we need some creative solutions. Rabbi Yochanan ben Barucha offers one. We have the intimation of another. And for us, to sort of take this away, which is to say, one is that Jubilee is something serious. It's not something that we're being frivolous about, right? It's not necessarily Joe Jolson Day. It's at City Hall, using your example, right? But, which can be serious.
And if you want, we'll come down when they take your picture.
But
we will do this for you.
But I do think it's important for us to recognize that we're talking about a state of justice, meaning to say that this is a year where justice is being made. Freedom is being given, debts are being forgiven. There's a real shift here. And so we want to be exacting. We want to be clear, because what we're talking about is justice. We're talking about what God has decided and created a structure for us so that we can do justice. And so we want to be exacting. We want to be clear so that we're not absolving someone of what's due to them. And as Olivia said, right, which is we have human rights here to deal with.
Yeah, we're
right?
giving the right for a do-over.
Right, and so it's important. Yeah.
One of the things that's ignored here is, didn't they blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah?
It's maybe
If you're talking about
Sure.
blowing the shofar, we blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah.
but it
That's
didn't
true.
say that.
So it focuses on Yom
You got
Kippur,
blood, yeah.
on the shofar blowing on Yom
On Yom
Kippur,
Kippur.
but it is a reasonable question to find out what role does the shofar blast in Rosh Hashanah play.
Uh-huh.
Absolutely, that's a great question. It's a great point. Absolutely. Okay, we're going to end there for today. We will not be meeting next week because it is Shavuot. I will say the following, which is on Saturday night is the Tikkun Leil Shavuot, the community Tikkun, which is at the JCC. Everyone is invited to come to that. Second, on Sunday afternoon after Kiddush, we will be celebrating a week late, but the International Seminar of Halachic Study, where we will be learning one of the tshuvot of the conservative movement. In this case, which is, can you join a minyan over the internet? Digital minyanim.
When is this?
This will be on Sunday, the week of Shavuot. This will be Sunday afternoon, right after Kiddush. No, so you'll have a chance to come in late to shul, and then you can come or just come to this. I'll be
Will it
teaching
be
that.
live stream so I can learn over the internet?
No,
Right. It won't be,
Of
but
course not.
right. But you can hope.
Because it's Chag.
You can hope. So join us for that.
wow.
And
When
then
is
that's Sunday after Kiddush,
Next
after
Sunday.
services. So that'll be great. And then on Monday we will be. It's all Yizkor. So if that's your thing, make sure to come to that. So those are the things that are happening next week. We will be meeting in 2 weeks. I won't be here because I will be on my honeymoon. So
Again?
the first time, and I won't miss any of you. No, just kidding. We are going to Europe, but I'm going to end this because we don't need to talk about those details.